May 6, 1945. A German general walked into Dwight Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France, with an extraordinary proposal. General Alfred Jodl had arrived that evening, accompanied by Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeburg, who had just failed to negotiate a separate peace with Montgomery 2 days earlier. They carried a new offer. Germany would surrender to America and Britain immediately. Every soldier, every tank, every aircraft on the Western Front would lay down arms. But there was a condition. Germany wanted to keep fighting the Soviet Union. Not just keep fighting, they wanted American fuel, American supplies, American support. The German High Command was proposing an alliance. Yesterday's enemies fighting together against the Red Army. General Alfred Jodl stood before Eisenhower's staff and made the case. The Soviets were the real threat to Western civilization. Germany had been holding them back for 4 years. If America helped them continue, Stalin could be stopped at the current lines. Eisenhower's response would shape the next 50 years of history. 6 days earlier, Adolf Hitler had shot himself in his Berlin bunker. His designated successor was Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German Navy. Dönitz saw himself primarily as a naval officer. Whatever his views on Nazi ideology, he had watched Germany's strategic position collapse over 4 years. He inherited a nightmare. Berlin had fallen to the Soviets. American and Soviet forces had linked up at the Elbe River, cutting Germany in two. Millions of German soldiers were trapped in pockets across Europe with nowhere to go. Dönitz understood one thing clearly: the war was lost. Germany could not win. But he also understood something else. Germany might still choose who it lost to. Surrender to the Americans meant prisoner of war camps, trials for some leaders, occupation, and eventually rebuilding. Surrender to the Soviets meant systematic brutality, deportation to Siberian labor camps, and the permanent enslavement of the German people. Dönitz made a calculated decision. He would try to surrender only to the West while continuing to fight in the East. Every German soldier on the Eastern Front understood what Dönitz understood. Soviet captivity meant death. The Red Army had suffered 27 million dead fighting Germany. Soviet soldiers had liberated concentration camps and seen German atrocities firsthand. Revenge was not just permitted, it was encouraged. German troops who surrendered to the Soviets faced summary execution, starvation in open-air camps, or decades of forced labor in Siberia. Of approximately 3 million German soldiers captured by the Red Army, historians estimate roughly 1 million died in captivity, a mortality rate exceeding 30%. In American or British hands, the mortality rate was under 3%. The math was simple: surrender west or die east. So German soldiers ran. Entire divisions abandoned their positions and marched west, hoping to reach American lines before the Soviets caught them. German civilians did the same. Millions of refugees clogged the roads, fleeing the advancing Red Army. Women who had heard what happened in East Prussia. Families who could hear Soviet artillery growing closer with each passing hour. For a mother in a refugee wagon or a soldier in a foxhole, every hour of negotiation in Reims wasn't diplomacy. It was the difference between a life in the West or a death in the East. Dönitz's proposal to Eisenhower wasn't abstract strategy. It was the desperate calculation of a nation watching the clock run out. Dönitz's first attempt came on May 4th. He sent Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeburg to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's headquarters at Lüneburg Heath. Von Friedeburg proposed exactly what Dönitz wanted. German forces in the north would surrender to the British, but he also wanted to include German forces facing the Soviets, specifically Army Group Vistula fighting in the east. Montgomery accepted part of the offer. He took the surrender of roughly 1 million German troops in Holland, northwest Germany, and Denmark, but he refused to touch the Eastern Front. No separate deals that excluded the Soviets. The tactical surrender was signed. The larger proposal was dead. Donitz received the news and didn't give up. If Montgomery wouldn't deal on the Eastern question, perhaps Eisenhower would. He sent a higher-ranking officer to try again. General Alfred Jodl, chief of operations for the German High Command, flew to Rans on May 6th with von Friedeberg at his side. Jodl carried the same proposal, and he carried something else: authorization to negotiate. Alfred Jodl was one of the most senior officers in the German military. He had been Hitler's chief strategic advisor throughout the war. Now he sat across from Eisenhower's chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, making Germany's case. The argument was straightforward. Germany could not survive Soviet occupation. Stalin's forces were already imposing communist dictatorships on Poland, Romania, and Hungary. They would do the same everywhere they occupied. Germany had been fighting the Soviets for 4 years. German soldiers knew Soviet tactics, Soviet weaknesses, Soviet supply vulnerabilities. If the Western Allies provided support, Germany could continue holding the Eastern line. Jodl proposed that German forces surrender to America and Britain while maintaining defensive positions against the Red Army. American supplies would keep them fighting. American air power would support them. The implication was clear. This wasn't just surrender. This was a proposal to switch sides. Eisenhower never met with Jodl personally. He refused to be in the same room with German officers until they accepted unconditional surrender. The refusal wasn't just professional. 3 weeks earlier, Eisenhower had walked through the Ohrdruf concentration camp. He had seen the stacked bodies, the cremation pits, the walking skeletons. He had ordered every American unit in the area to witness what the Nazi regime had done. Now generals from that regime were asking him for an alliance. The moral revulsion was visceral. But Eisenhower also understood the strategic argument, and he understood why it was impossible. The United States was still fighting Japan. American military planners were counting on Soviet entry into the Pacific War to help defeat the Japanese. Betraying Stalin in Europe would mean fighting Japan alone. The American public still saw the Soviets as heroic allies. Newspapers portrayed Uncle Joe Stalin as a friendly partner. The idea of suddenly allying with Nazi Germany against the Russians would have caused political chaos. Roosevelt had made agreements at Yalta. The Soviets would occupy Eastern Europe. Germany would be divided into occupation zones. Breaking those agreements meant breaking America's word. And there was the most practical problem of all. The Soviet Union had 11 million men under arms, with roughly 6.5 million frontline troops in Europe alone. If Eisenhower accepted the German proposal and Stalin kept fighting, the Red Army might not stop at Berlin. They might march to the Atlantic. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. Accept the German offer and risk World War III with the Soviets. Reject it and hand half of Europe to Stalin. He had just seen what one totalitarian regime did to millions of people. Now he was being asked to choose between confronting another or abandoning millions more to its grip. Eisenhower's response to Jodl was delivered through General Smith. It was not a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. Germany would surrender unconditionally to all Allied powers, including the Soviet Union. All German forces on all fronts would cease fighting simultaneously. There would be no separate peace with the West. If Germany refused, Eisenhower would close the Western lines. American and British forces would stop accepting German surrenders. Every German soldier trying to flee west would be turned back, directly into Soviet hands. Eisenhower gave Jodl a deadline. accept by midnight on May 8th, or face the consequences. Jodl sent an urgent message to Dönitz. Eisenhower was not bluffing. The Americans would really force German soldiers to surrender to the Soviets if Germany didn't accept unconditional terms. Dönitz faced the end of his strategy. The Western Allies would not save Germany from the Soviets. There would be no alliance against Stalin. Not everyone in the American command thought Eisenhower was making the right choice. General George Patton had been warning about the Soviet threat for months. He had seen Red Army behavior in the areas where American and Soviet forces met. He had read intelligence reports about widespread atrocities and deportations in Soviet-occupied territory. Patton was furious. He told anyone who would listen that the Americans had defeated the wrong enemy. Germany was broken. The Soviet Union was the real danger. He voiced the same strategic logic the Germans were voicing. Rearm the Wehrmacht. Use German soldiers who knew how to fight the Soviets. Push Stalin back to the pre-war borders while American forces were still at full strength. Patton said America would have to fight the Soviets eventually. Better to do it now, with battle-hardened troops and air supremacy, than later when the Soviets had recovered and built atomic weapons. His superiors told him to be quiet. Publicly advocating war with America's ally was career suicide. But Patton couldn't stay quiet. The window was closing, and nobody in Washington seemed to care. He wasn't the only one thinking this way. Winston Churchill had ordered his military staff to draw up plans for attacking the Soviets. The plan was called Operation Unthinkable. Churchill's planners proposed rearming 100,000 German soldiers, roughly 10 divisions, to fight alongside Allied forces in a surprise attack against the Red Army. The target date was July 1st, 1945. The German proposal wasn't Nazi desperation. It was the same strategic logic that Western military leaders were privately considering. Dönitz received Jodl's message about Eisenhower's ultimatum. He made one final calculation. He authorized Jodl to sign the unconditional surrender, but he also gave secret orders. German forces in the West would stop fighting immediately, but German forces facing the Soviets would continue resistance as long as possible. Every hour bought time for more soldiers and civilians to flee west. Every hour the Eastern Front held meant thousands more lives saved. It was a race against the clock. The moment Eisenhower realized what was happening, he would close the Western lines. Dönitz needed to buy as many hours as possible. The German Navy would accelerate evacuations across the Baltic Sea. Operation Hannibal was already the largest naval evacuation in history, rescuing between 1 and 2 million soldiers and civilians from Soviet-occupied territory. It would continue until the last possible moment. Dönitz was playing a double game. He would give Eisenhower the surrender document he demanded, but he would ignore its requirement for simultaneous ceasefire on all fronts. At 2:41 a.m. on May 7, 1945, General Jodl signed the instrument of surrender at Eisenhower's headquarters in Rans. The war in Europe was officially over. Except it wasn't. The clock was still running. German units kept fighting in the east for 2 more days. Stalin was furious when he learned about the Rans surrender. He saw exactly what the Germans had done. Surrendered to the West while continuing to fight the Soviets. He demanded a second surrender ceremony. This one would take place in Berlin at Soviet headquarters with Soviet commanders presiding. On May 8th, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the surrender again at Karlshorst. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov made sure the world saw German officers submitting to Soviet authority. The signing happened late on May 8th, but in Moscow it was already past midnight. The West celebrates victory in Europe on May 8th. The Soviet Union celebrated Victory Day on May 9th. Even the date of surrender became contested. Even then, German resistance continued. Some units fought until May 11th, buying time for last-minute evacuations. Dönitz's strategy had partially worked. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers reached American and British lines before the final ceasefire. Millions of civilians escaped Soviet occupation. But the larger gamble had failed. There would be no Western alliance against Stalin. Eastern Europe would fall behind what Churchill would soon call the Iron Curtain. And for those who didn't escape, the nightmare was just beginning. Everything the Germans warned about came true, and it happened fast. Within months of the surrender, the Soviets had installed communist puppet governments across Eastern Europe. Poland's democratic leaders were arrested or executed. Czechoslovakia's foreign minister died in a suspicious fall from a window. Free elections promised at Yalta never happened. Opposition parties were banned. Secret police rounded up anyone suspected of anti-communist sympathies. The Iron Curtain descended exactly where German and Soviet forces had met in May 1945. 100 million people found themselves trapped behind it. The German soldiers who had surrendered to the Soviets fared exactly as badly as Dönitz had predicted. Roughly 1 in 3 died in captivity. The last German POWs, approximately 10,000 men known as the late returnees, weren't released until October 1955, following West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's visit to Moscow. 10 years after the war ended, these men stepped off trains into a country they no longer recognized. Their families had mourned them and moved on. Their children had grown up without them. They were ghosts of a war that Germany had spent a decade trying to forget. But by then, it was too late to do anything about it. In 1947, President Truman announced the Truman Doctrine. The United States would oppose Soviet expansion anywhere in the world. The policy of containment had begun. In 1949, NATO was founded. The United States, Britain, France, and other Western nations formed a military alliance against the Soviet threat. The alliance that Eisenhower had rejected 4 years earlier now existed, just without Germany. In 1955, a transformed West Germany, democratic, denazified, rebuilt under Allied supervision, was rearmed and admitted to NATO. The date of admission was May 9th, 1955, exactly 10 years to the day after the Soviet-led surrender ceremony in Berlin. The Bundeswehr was officially established that November. This was not the Wehrmacht reborn. It was a new army under democratic civilian control, integrated into Western command structures. But many of its officers had served in 1945. They remembered the proposal that had been refused. The difference between 1945 and 1955 was 10 years and 100 million people trapped behind the Iron Curtain. The strategic logic had been sound. The timing had been impossible. Eisenhower became president in 1953. He spent 8 years managing the Cold War that might have been prevented in 1945. He never publicly expressed regret about rejecting the German proposal. He maintained that unconditional surrender to all allies was the only acceptable outcome. But by 1945, the Soviets were exhausted. American air power was overwhelming. American industry was untouched. A confrontation then might have been winnable in ways that later confrontation wasn't. All of them, Patton, Churchill, the Germans, were proven right about Soviet intentions. Whether they were right about the solution remains the great unanswered question of the 20th century. But for the 100 million people trapped behind the Iron Curtain, the answer didn't matter. The Berlin Wall went up. Families were separated for decades. People were shot trying to cross from east to west. Eisenhower hadn't said no to an alliance. He had said wait. And the wait lasted 45 years.